DEC came in here, and at the time, and even I still, they had a meeting with the people in this neighborhood, and they convinced them that eradication was the best strategy, the only strategy. And I commended these people they kind of really took one for the team, because they agreed to have all the oak trees within 100 feet of any of the infected trees cut, on the suspicion that they might also be infected through root grafts and are not yet showing symptoms. And this was a massive operation. And while I got this map up, let me just tell you that the homeowners were told that if they didn't agree to this, if they insisted on leaving their trees up, that they would have to agree to have them injected with a fungicide every year for the duration of the lives of the trees. And if the tree then had to be cut, they had to pay for it. The state picked up this bill. Anyways, the one lone tree that this got saved was right here. All the rest of these were cut, and it was like shock and awe. So this is just one area. I've got a whole bunch of these kinds of pictures, but this is the way it looked before they came through, and that's the way it looked afterwards. And it was, everywhere you looked, it was just very, very dramatic. But it appeared to be successful. The surveys in that area continued for the next 3 or 4 years. Nothing showed up. And I, as I say, every chance I got, I tried to publicly acknowledge what a sacrifice these people made and the apparent success of it. That is apparent until 2013. When then one last tree that the guy didn't treat, he kind of got tired of paying for the injections, and lo and behold, it died, and so that was taken out as well. But then, with no other oaks around, we thought, okay, we're over the hump here. And then last year, things got pretty exciting. We had this discovery of oak wilt up in the Canandaigua area. And also, if you can see, there was quite a few discoveries down here on Long Island, and especially at Greenwood Cemetery in New York, in Brooklyn. And where all this came from, why did this happen all at once? Again, our inclination is to look somehow at how firewood might have come in. The firewood trade even though we work as hard as we can, is not well regulated. And when you order a load of firewood on the internet, on eBay or something like that, you have no idea where it's coming from. And sometimes this stuff sneaks through various inspection efforts. In any case, it has been discovered. Now, the other thing, though, that I gotta tell you is that all of this diagnostic work down here on Long Island in Brooklyn has not been as a result of growing the fungus in culture, but rather through a DNA analysis of microbes that happen to be living in the wood or wood chips or bark of the samples that were sent up. The DNA analysis is supposed to be reliable. And I am not going to stand up here and discredit it, but I also have to tell you that there's this little nagging doubt about that. And it's not just me. A number of us would really like to get a culture. We'd really like to see pressure pads, even just getting a culture. But it can be tricky, and we and the DEC and the Ag and Markets will be going after that with gusto this season to confirm all of that. Well, let me show you that one of the biggest areas of concern is at Greenwood Cemetery there in Brooklyn. And they have one tree that was confirmed diseased. It showed all the classic other symptoms, the rapid wilt, the dropping of leaves and everything else. I'm not sure whether the vascular discoloration was there, but my understanding is that the culture never did emerge. But nonetheless, they took that down. Now, if we look at, just to show you what's at risk in Greenwood, the blue or the red are all red oaks, the red dots. The blue is pin oak. And then, let's see, is that right? Have I got that right? Yeah, and then yellow is, there's a few shingled oaks in here too. But this is an enormous resource, and if you're not familiar with Greenwood Cemetery, it is an incredible natural resource. It's a historic resource. It's just a very, very important place. And thank goodness, if we zero in on this, here's the infected tree. The next closest infected tree, or within 150 feet, there are no other oaks, thank God. And within 300 feet, then we have a couple of possibilities. But with fingers crossed, I'm hoping that this eradication of that tree will eradicate the disease from Greenwood, at least until some future introduction comes along. Many of those other spots where you had trees lined up one next to the other, you can bet your bottom dollar they're all grafted together, and I don't know how many you'd have to take down to try to eradicate this thing. So this one, if it had to happen anywhere, I guess this is probably the best spot, and I can assure you that the people that are in charge of the grounds down there are on this like crazy, and we just keep our fingers crossed that this isn't going to go away. John might mention, or Neil might mention, I'll tell you too, that breaking root grafts by trenching is another option, which is practiced in many cases. But how in the world are you going to trench in a cemetery? You know, like, there's a lot of important bodies beneath the surface there, and I don't think you want to screw around with that. So that's as much as I have to tell you about oak wilt right now. I still think we have a good chance of staying on top of it in New York State, and I frankly elsewhere in the Northeast, but it's going to take vigilance. Oh, I should also mention that in the course of some of these conversations, one day somebody said, so do you think it's possible we could have an outbreak like the one they had in Pittsburgh? I said, what are you talking about? Well, it turns out they're having a hell of a problem in Pittsburgh. Neil, you maybe know more about that. I hadn't even heard of that before. Nobody had been talking about it anywhere. And when I started to dig around a little bit, yeah, they've got quite a problem. And if you get on Google Earth and look from Pittsburgh north to New York, once you get outside of the city limits, it's red oak all the way up the corridor right into the New York State, especially western part of the state. And so we're looking extra hard there as well. Okay, I want to move on and talk about another disease, and this one is a bacterial disease. It was originally described in 1892 on grapes in California by a man named Pierce, and somebody, I don't know whether they realized it or not, but they thought they were honoring him by calling it Pierce's disease. But it was a massive decline of grapes, wine grapes, and it was no trivial matter. And in 1892, and for the next 50 years, people, or maybe 60 years, all of the evidence pointed to it being caused by a virus. It could be graft transmitted. All the little chips of wood you took out of infected plants, nothing grew in a petri dish. Sap could be used to transmit the disease. And so it just had all the features and nothing microscopic. You could look till brains were, and nothing microscopic. So people concluded it was a virus, except there was one little catch, and that is if you took sap from an infected tree or plant and filtered it before you inoculated, you couldn't transmit the disease. And so that kind of caused some people to pause a bit, and others just said, oh, it must be a really big virus, and it got hung up in the filter. And then in 1973, the thing was finally identified. That's just a picture of some of this decline. Anyways, somebody looking more closely at the plant tissue found these minuscule particles in the xylem. And on looking more carefully, they discovered that in fact those minuscule particles were bacterial cells. They eventually called it Xylella fastidiosa, Xylella, because it lived in the xylem, fastidiosa, because you couldn't grow it very easily. It was a fussy eater. And also then with further, and it didn't take a lot of work even by then, but it was obviously or could easily be transmitted by sap-sucking insects, especially leafhoppers and spittlebugs. Well, in the grape business, then, the disease was primarily in the southeastern part of the U.S. In fact, even though the initial description was out here in California, on further investigation, they found that really there was all kinds of this going on in Florida. But this was at a time when the Florida wine industry wasn't exactly flourishing. So I don't think it got quite the same attention. It definitely didn't. But as time passed, people did become aware of it. But it was limited to the south, and this was presumably because the vectors were well, no, there's two things. The vectors, first of all, seemed to be somewhat temperature sensitive. But also the bacterium was temperature sensitive. And there was some temperature threshold that occurred in the winter that, for lack of a better term, I'm going to say just froze those bacteria out. And so infected plants that were in a climate or a period where there was colder weather, they would emerge the next season, for all intents and purposes, recovered or healthy. So most important discoveries then, leafhoppers and other sap-sucking insects, but not aphids, by the way, are primary vectors, and there are a lot of them. I don't mean a lot of leafhoppers, a lot of different species that could be involved in transmission of this thing. Fortunately, the bacteria don't multiply in the insects. They will persist for a long time in their bodies, but they don't multiply, and this was a big deal because a lot of virus diseases, the viruses do multiply in the insects. The glassy-winged sharpshooters are most effective, and they are prolific, and they have a lot of different host plants. I put like over 100, but it may be even over 200. Both the bacteria and the sharpshooters sensitive to cold temperatures, which did seem to limit northward spread. In grapes, some varieties are more resistant than others, and the resistance factors are heritable. The good news there is that with grapes, if you do have some resistant cultivars, and there are some that are at least more resistant than others, it's possible you could use those as breeding stock for development of other resistant varieties. The bacteria plugs vessels of the host by forming biofilms of, okay, so biofilm is a scientific term. Goop isn't. But that's what the biofilm is. In fact, it kind of is like the tyloses in oak, except that here that plugs up the xylem and gives eventually leads to the scorch symptom. And for the present, I'll just mention that insects that parasitize the insect vectors in grapes seem to provide, that is, insects now that parasitize the leafhoppers or the sharpshooters seem to provide enough biocontrol to keep the incidence of this disease at manageable levels if people really stick to it. And if it's also combined with prompt eradication of diseased plants whenever they show up. But this is still an enormous headache, and millions of dollars are being poured into this thing. And I must also say now that if I continue on here, then we've since discovered that same bacterium causes leaf scorch in alum and platanus and mulberry, and among other things, oak. And it has quite a long host range. In addition to woody plants, there's tons of herbaceous plants, weeds, and other herbs and other herbaceous plants that are hosts. So the pathogen has an enormous host range, and the perception that seems to be worthwhile at this point is that in many cases in these other hosts they don't show any symptoms. So the bacterium can kind of hang out there, build up, and then wait for these leafhoppers to come by and pick up the cells and then move them on to more desirable plants. And of course, the reason we're talking about this at all today is because oaks are one group of trees that are also affected, and in particular, red oaks more than white oaks. And while I've never seen anybody write anything concretely about this, I have to think that one major reason the red oaks are so susceptible again is the ease with which these bacteria can move through those big fat xylem vessels. In fact, one of my colleagues up at Cornell spent some time, he was a microscopist, video microscopist, and he, through some very elaborate experiments, showed that the bacteria just don't sit there, but they actually twitch. And in twitching, almost like, I don't know, like dolphins, they kind of flip through, but they actively move through the xylem from one cell to another, and that also enables their spread. Okay, so we know now. Okay, so let me just point out one other thing: is that bacteria are incredibly adept at changing, depending on whatever environment they're exposed to, and so we're pretty sure now that the same variety, the same strain that occurs in grapes is not the one that occurs in our deciduous trees here in the east. And I don't know if anybody knows for sure just how many different strains there are and how this affects host range. But when we think of comparison to fungal pathogens, the opportunity for adaptability is really quite profound. And it also becomes profound when we think about adaptability to climate. Because whereas the grape pathogen is kind of relegated to these warmer areas, it may be that the bacterium that we're seeing in shade trees has the capacity to move further north. In fact, we know it does because of more and more samples that come in from places very close to us. The symptoms, in some cases, you start out with the scorch on the margins of the leaves, and then this may be followed by overall decline. But the decline is not rapid like it is with oak wilt. It usually extends over a period of several years, and occasionally some trees recover. In other cases, rather than seeing a whole tree decline, you might just see individual branches display the scorch symptom. And let me emphasize, you guys have been in this business long enough to know that there are all kinds of things that cause marginal scorch. Besides oak wilt and this disease, we've got salt, we've got drought, a number of other environmental factors. And so the scorch symptom is a good place to start, but it may not be the be-all and end-all. There's been a lot of work in recent years down in New Jersey by folks at Rutgers, and what they have seemed to have determined is that their epicenter, at least in New Jersey, seems to be right around Camden, and this shows the mid-1980s. By the early 1990s, it had moved further out, and it seems to be expanding north and south in New Jersey. And I think we kind of are pretty sure now that it even has extended northwards into this part of New York State. We don't know how far north it's gone or how much farther it might go. We don't have that glassy winged sharpshooter, which is the key vector for the grape pathogen, but we got a lot of others that could be carrying it. And the oaks that show up in New Jersey, at least, we got black oak, northern red pin, post, scarlet shingle, and swamp white. But there are a lot of others that could also be susceptible. And as far as I know, they really haven't found. But Rutgers folks are really the ones who are doing the most aggressive survey at this particular point in time, and so we kind of are looking to them for more. Other hosts, I mentioned platanus, maple, elm. This is a Norway maple, and quite frankly, if I saw this tree in the field before this whole scorch thing showed up, I would have just written this off as maybe girdling roots or some other environmental problem, a soil problem. But the fact of the matter is that this did test positive for scorch, and that was quite alarming. This is some of these leafhopper vectors. Actually, this one up in the upper left-hand corner is this glassy wing sharpshooter, which is a vector where the climate is favorable. Others, I can't even tell you for sure what their names are, but they are quite similar. I think you're familiar with them, and especially that distinctive piercing, sucking mouth part that they have. Let me keep moving here. Okay, so one of the kind of puzzling things here is that some infected plants do recover, and nobody knows why, but the presumption might be, as I mentioned earlier, this freezing out of the pathogen. But what's more puzzling is that you can have two trees right next to each other, same species. One will be massively infected, or at least showing massive symptoms of scorch, and the other one won't. And the other one might not ever show them, at least for as long as people have been looking. And the question is that tree resistant? It's hard to believe that if you had I don't know what you'd call it, a squadron of leafhoppers come through, that they would just land on one tree or not the other. But my fervent hope is that in fact we do have some resistance in various species in the population, and someone like you youngsters who are still looking to make your million in this business will start to propagate these things and get us off the hook here. So these are some questions that people are asking out loud, and I'll just quickly, is bacterial leaf scorch on the rise, or are people just looking harder, finding what was already there? Neil will tell you, and I have no reason to doubt that that's probably not the case. He thinks it's really spreading, and like I say, he's out looking at these things a lot more than I have. But the question is asked, and I think the test for this, the bacterium, does involve, again, DNA sequencing of whatever you extract from the trees, and it's expensive, and you just don't do this, wander through the woods, just take samples by the thousands, because you just don't have the money to do it. So now that people are looking, are they finding something that was already there? Well, it's a question that maybe has been answered. What really is the association of the bacterial infection and environmental stress? Leaf scorch symptoms have been attributed to all these other things, drought, de-icing salt, vascular infection, root disease. Are we sure now that those agents didn't simply unmask a bacterial infection that was always there? And I partly raise this because there is this large cohort of herbaceous and woody shrubs that we know become infected, but they never show any symptoms. And so to what extent might that extend? And we wouldn't have known that they even were infected if we hadn't taken time to look. So I don't know. I think these are things to be thinking about. Oh, come on here. Why do symptomatic, asymptomatic trees, plants grow close together? And I don't know. We don't know. Scale insect? No, I'm just saying it. I mean, it happens often, and when that kind of thing does happen, I mean, you wouldn't expect that with Dutch elm disease or oak wilt or anthracnose or any disease. So, scale insects, borers. This is a quote. Scale insects, borers, armillaria, root rot, ganoderma, butt rot, and other pests and pathogens often express themselves on scorch-affected trees. And the question that people are asking is, really? Do we know it's not the other way around? That these other pests or pathogens have predisposed the tree sufficiently that some latent population of bacteria has surfaced? And again, I just raised the question. And then the other thing, from the day I walked into the office at Cornell the first time, is that there were people who had been studying so-called maple decline, oak decline. Those were two of the big ones in the Appalachian Mountains for years. And there was all kinds of, and it all came down to, at the end of the day, despite what the graduate student concluded in the last chapter of his PhD thesis was, we don't know. But you know, at that time we had things like gypsy moth, we had tent caterpillars, some pretty serious insect defoliators that would weaken the trees. Lurking at the bottom were things like armillaria root rot and perhaps Phytophthora cankers and just a whole bunch of things. So they kind of said, well, there's this smorgasbord of conditions that kind of all happened together, and that's led to these declines that we're seeing. But now I'm inclined to wonder, well, maybe this whole bacterial problem was being overlooked all this time. Overlooked because the particles were so small and you couldn't culture them, and they simply didn't make themselves apparent. And it's just one of many issues that this whole episode is. And then, is climate change affecting vector biology, enabling survival farther north? It's something we're thinking about. You may argue about what's causing climate change, but the fact that it's occurring, I think, is pretty clear. And these pathogens and their vectors, being as sensitive they are to temperatures, warmer periods of time, warmer weather for longer periods of time could be the difference. And then finally, I'll just throw this up here. I hate to have it way down here at the bottom, but is anybody going to try to do anything? And you know, this just frustrates the hell out of me. I'm too old now to wait another 10 years for every last detail of this situation to be ironed out before we start taking some concrete steps at trying to manage this thing. And I am hoping that some people, and it's more likely to be you folks in the field doing your individual treatments, maybe even, are you getting pesticide certification credit for this? Maybe even kind of extending the use of certain pesticides that maybe weren't labeled, just to see if you can bring this under control. I think people are going to have to start experimenting. I don't think you can count on the academic communities to do this stuff. It just isn't a high priority, and people like yourselves are probably going to start to put some of the answers together. Okay, let me move quickly to my last topic, and that is one called sudden oak death. I'm going to try to move along here because I haven't got much time. Anyways, the disease, sudden oak death is a disease caused by a fungus-like pathogen called Rramorum. And it was, although it was first observed in the United States and California on tan oaks, which are not true oaks, they're in the genus Lithocarpus and other oaks, it also affects many, many other plant species. And the timeline, this Rramorum was actually first discovered in California, or in Europe back in 1993, but this was on plants like rhododendrons and azaleas. It wasn't first discovered on oaks. And in fact, it showed up in California in 1995, and mainly in Marin County. And when it showed up, it was rather quick, and you can understand why it was called sudden oak death. Some aerial photos here just to give you the idea of how this thing unfolded. Really shook people up, not only in forested areas but in landscapes as well, and it was just quite shocking. Within a short period of time, it was discovered that this Rramorum was the cause of sudden oak death, and at that point it was assumed to be the same pathogen that occurred in Europe. And these are some pictures that I took when I was out there, just to further emphasize what the dramatic conversion of those portions of California coast were undergoing. If you got closer to those trees, you'd find bleeding cankers, and then peel the bark back and you would find a necrotic xylem. Now this red is more a reflection of just the nature of that bark. You shouldn't assume that every time you peel the bark back on a Phytophthora-caused canker that you're going to get this kind of red discoloration. But nonetheless, the xylem is necrotic. And then this continued to spread to 12 other California counties and up into Oregon. And then in 2002, it was determined that in fact the European and US strains were different. And that was a kind of an important thing as we tried to figure out how this all went together. Let's see here. Okay. And then this is the biggie from our perspective, is that in 2004, P. Rramorum was found in a Los Angeles County nursery, not on oak, but on, I believe that first round was azaleas. But these were nurseries. This nursery was a big one. I'm not going to name it, but it was a big one that shipped nursery stock all over the country. And in fact, it was quickly discovered that a lot of that potentially infected stock had been shipped all the way out here. Fortunately, at that particular point in time, we had in place, as a result of Homeland Security initiatives, the National Plant Diagnostic Network, and in the Northeast, we were the Northeast division of that. And we were all set to undertake an enormously complex, massive trace forward and trace back surveys. So they started, I don't want to say we, because the officials started with the sales records of that nursery in Los Angeles County, found out where all the plants had gone. And then when those that came out our way, we had people here that went to each of those nurseries or garden centers that were selling the plants and found out who did you sell them to, and went out and actually looking, examining every possible plant that could have caused, maybe been a source for carrying the pathogen. As I recall, we only one plant was found, and it was, or maybe two, but they were dug up and destroyed on right on the place, and then they were also marked on a map for continued revisit by inspectors for several years later. But this inspection process has continued, and so behind the scenes, unless you're in the nursery industry or run a garden center, you might not be aware of it, but behind the scenes is this continual examination of plants being raised for shipment, raised on the West Coast for shipment elsewhere in the country. And in the meantime, the Forest Service kind of looked at, well, what's the weather like? What's the climate like? What are the soils in California? And where else in the U.S. are we like that? And of course, we've got this whole portion of the eastern U.S. So intense scrutiny at every turn in the road. Let me go quickly through the host list, kind of like bacterial leaf scorch, is enormous. It's not just trees, but all kinds of other things that you will be familiar with in the landscape. And we even can go on beyond that in terms of trees. See, it's so screwy. It's not just wilt or death of oak trees, but on grand fir, you get little twig blight. On horse chestnut, you get leaf spots. On European beech, you get leaf spots. It goes on and on. And to detect this is an enormous challenge. And then lurking in the back of your mind is, what happens if something sneaks through? As far as we know, it hasn't. Or if it has, it's been picked up and we've gotten rid of it. Major symptoms, bleeding bark canker, but foliar blight and twig dieback. The bleeding canker is like we would expect to see from other pathogens. So this is what you'd see in California on a sudden oak death infected plant. Out California, necrotic lesions on rhododendron leaves, calmia. And then this twig dieback. But you've been in this business. These are not unique symptoms. And each one, if we're going to be concerned about it, requires some scrutiny. And people are trying to keep this all in perspective, but it's a big, big job. And then, of course, they're confusing. Foma leaf spot. We got this on mountain laurel. Bleeding cankers. Okay, so are they diagnostic? Well, maybe, but maybe not. We know that our malaria, without the bark peeled back, sometimes causes bleeding cankers, and armillaria in and of itself can be an enormous problem on stressed oak trees. And then there are bleeding cankers caused by species of Phytophthora, which also can give of other species of Phytophthora, I should say, could give a similar symptom. My experience has been that these other Phytophtheras don't pose the kind of threat by any stretch of the imagination that the Rramorum might pose if it were to get into these trees. But we just don't know for sure where Rramorum would go. Okay, so I think I'm gonna stop with this one. This is the fungus. It's not a fungus. This is new discovery. It's not. Anyways, it's a microbe that's more closely related to algae. But I wanted to show you that it's the critical moisture. A lot of moisture is critical for the survival and spread of this organism because it produces spores in little capsules, and then the spores are liberated from the capsules and they swim away. And I just happen to have a video here that I hope will allow me to show you this. Watch this now. See that capsule of protoplasm? All of a sudden it kind of comes to life. And the goop oozes out. And then all of those turn out to be individual cells, and they start to squirm and quiver, and they swim away. And if the environment is right and there's enough water, they don't swim a long ways, but they're able to find oftentimes living tissue to infect. Okay, I just mentioned this whole business about concern about spread on nursery stock. And I think probably I'm gonna stop there and turn it over to Neil. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you so much for having me here today. It's quite a pleasure. You might notice as you listen to me that I'm not from around here. And the Yankee dandruff falling around outside, I wasn't prepared for that. I'm just joking. What an honor to get a chance to hear these people that have done so much as far as the foundation of knowledge that we have, that the company that I am honored to work for, Bartlett Tree Experts, can use every day in the field. In thinking about this topic, I kind of got started into it because of a mystery. I began Bartlett about 1.5 years ago, and I was in my dream job already, and I got a call, and I was like, oh, I don't know. But once I got into Bartlett, I saw the beautiful 400-acre research arboretum that we have down in Charlotte, North Carolina, and had an opportunity to see the kind of work that we do. It was a no-brainer to come do that. And plus, I get to come and talk to people like yourselves. So, why are we here? Don't worry, don't run away. I'm not going to get into my personal existential crises, especially not so close to lunch. I'm going to kind of talk about how I developed my interest in oak and oak decline and what might be causing it. Because as the entomologist for Bartlett, it is my job to look after the trees under our care and to provide answers so that we can either prevent things from happening to them or, make them better if they've gotten sick. My poor husband wanted to marry a doctor, and once he looked at my paycheck, he realized that he married the wrong kind of doctor. So as an entomologist, not quite. But I do feel like they're my patients. I think somebody said that earlier. Generally, when I come and do a talk, I'm the Debbie Downer of the entire thing. I've never been called a bonus guest. Entomologists, it's usually like, oh God, we have to let the entomologist talk. We'll give her a few minutes at the end. But actually, because I actually like to talk about the positives of trees, that's why we are in the business that we are in and why we love it. But I often have to come and talk to people about all of the things that are coming in and killing the trees. So I'm going to talk about a few pests, insect-specific, obviously, because that's my background, but there are certainly many diseases that contribute. So Neil, who is normally a very phlegmatic individual, gets to be the upper for the entire talk. So he's gonna come in and talk about the good stuff. So why are we here? Has anybody here seen the angel oak near Charleston, South Carolina? Absolutely gorgeous tree. Huge. I mean, the picture just cannot do it justice. It is a enormous live oak. We have the privilege of caring for. We have had to make sure that people don't climb on it anymore, which breaks my heart, because it is such a climbable tree. But why would we have a whole meeting about oaks declining? I think it's because oaks are a symbol of strength, right? A mighty oak, right? It's this big, strong thing, and suddenly we start seeing these big, strong symbols of strength falling. Sometimes suddenly, one by one. It's happening in people's backyards, not just in forestry. So I think, to echo what was said, really what we're seeing with oaks is death by 1,000 cuts, if you'll excuse my borrowing of this metaphor. It's called Ling Chi. This is an ancient torture method from Imperial China. It didn't stop until 1905. It wasn't stopped, but essentially it was just slow death by 1,000 little tiny cuts. And that's what I've been seeing when I was first called to the National Arboretum. We have a fantastic relationship with many arboreta around the country, and I have the privilege of getting to see many of these great places. But we got a call, and they said, we have had some oaks that they're dying. They'll be fine, and they're just flashing out. And so my first thought is, we've got, oak wilt has finally made it into DC. This is not good. It's going to spread around. And I thought, well, that's kind of exciting. I could find that. And I said, well, tell me a little bit more, because it's a diagnostic, right? You need to ask questions and figure out what's going on. And they said, well, I said, where are the plants? Where are these trees? How old are they? Well, they're all different ages. Some of them are in wooded settings. Some of them are in formal gardens. I said, well, it's been really dry. Tell me about irrigation. Oh, some are irrigated, some aren't. I said, well, and here I am starting to scratch my head, because suddenly this is not making as much sense to me. I said, well, how quickly are they dying? Well, over the years we'd get one or two that would die out, and now we're seeing, one that looks seemingly okay, and it'll die within a couple weeks. And we just can't figure out what's going on. It's like, well, I better fly up there. And this is not from the Arboretum, but it illustrates my point about death by 1,000 cuts. Certainly if you saw a tree with this kind of damage on it, it certainly looks like somebody caused death by 1,000 cuts. So I'm going to leave you hanging on the Arboretum mystery for a minute and talk a little bit about some of the invasive species, because as I start going through the diagnostic process and thinking through what could be causing some of the damage that I'm seeing, as an entomologist, they say when you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, right? As an entomologist, I tend to see insects as being part of the issue. And certainly I have job security. My paychecks may not be big, but I'll have them for a long, long time. And you'll see why. These particular wounds were caused by a pest I hope we don't get. This is the Polyphagous shothole borer in California. It is a minute, little tiny brown ambrosia beetle. Now in the South, we love ambrosia. That's like a dessert that you serve at Christmas that'll make your teeth hurt. It's so sweet. That's a special dish, but not this kind of ambrosia. This is a beetle that actually carries fungal spores in a special pouch on its body, special structure, and it carries them into the tree. And it does not, you can see that it's made some holes throughout the tissue of the tree, but it doesn't eat the tree. It pushes all of that out. It's actually gardening. It's farming fungus to feed the larvae. Now, that bacterial biofilm, or the term that I would prefer to use, the goop, that's produced because it also has bacteria as well as fungus inside, starts clogging up the vascular tissue. So as they're gardening, these fungi proliferate, the bacteria proliferate and begin to clog up the tissue. I've seen as few as just 2 or 3 beetles kill a giant oak tree. Not because of their boring damage, but because of this fungus that they're then bringing into the tree. So you can kind of see in this image sort of this white material inside some of these holes, and that's the fungal tissue, the fungal mycelia that the larvae will feed on. These are highly, highly attuned to plant stress signals, but they will also attack relatively healthy-looking plants. I wish I could say that this is the only one of these beetles that does this. There are probably about 47 or 48 species of ambrosia beetle, some on the East Coast, that have the same symbiotic relationship with this fungus and the beetle as the carrier for that. So just to give you a little bit of history, because I'm talking about an invasive species here, right? And I think we all have a fairly good sense of why invasive species end up taking off. But right here, this is a chart that shows the cumulative number of pest detections at ports and within the United States over a time frame of about pre-1700 to just beyond the turn of the century. So we have seen since probably about late 1700s, right after the 1800s, we see this precipitous increase in non-indigenous forest insect pests. Just huge. Same thing with these high-impact pests. These are the ones that come in, like the Polyphagous shothole borer, and do a massive amount of damage in a very large way. People very obviously know them. So what happened right here in the mid to late 1800s? What happened? It's those boats we talked about. Those damn boats. If they just built them all out of metal, we would have been fine. No, actually it is. It was the rise and transport of all of these goods from around the world. A lot of these boats were made of wood, which is one thing. Many of them were sealed and protected, so that probably wasn't the primary way. But they were loaded with crates and ballast, and often the ballast was soil, wood, casks, various wood materials that had forest pests. They were also bringing abundant numbers of plants over to this new place, this new beautiful place where they could now grow gardens. The plants that they loved in Europe, they could bring over and start growing. But if you take apart, because this was all number of species of arthropods that were coming over. If you just break apart the borers, those things that were in that wood material, you can see that we are in the era of borers from Asia. So that little Polyphagous shothole borer is a borer from Asia. Can anybody think of another borer from Asia that we're now becoming very aware of? Emerald ash borer, right? Asian longhorn beetle, very near and dear to New York's heart. Yes. So the cumulative number of established invasive scalided beetles, those little tiny brown ones that you wouldn't notice if you're sitting and drinking a beer on your back porch, you might have them dive bomb your drink. I don't know if anybody's noticed that. Those are ambrosia beetles. They can sense that alcohol. So invasive species and species that cause a lot of damage don't necessarily have to be from abroad, though. This is a really nasty one that's out in California. They always do things first, right? Or is it New York that gets the trends first? We'll let them keep this trend. How about that? The gold-spotted oak borer is a flat-headed borer, very much like emerald ash borer, and it started to decimate oak trees in California at an astonishing rate. People started noticing that this agrylus species, very much like emerald ambrosia beetle in Southern California, look how tiny that is. No wonder they didn't notice. So if I could show you thousands of pictures like this, but all of a sudden all of the oaks in this valley just started dying rapidly. They figured out that it was this beetle. It's actually native to southeastern Arizona. So why did it come to California and go wild? Well, just because something is not native to another country, it can be non-native within the same landmass, right? Because you have a whole another ecological system going on. As it moves into a new environment, like kids going off to college, they're not the same children that you sent. They act a little different in the new environment, right? How fast did this thing spread? How fast do most invasive species spread? I would say the top speed's probably about 120, but you'd get a speeding ticket. 60 miles an hour, 65 miles an hour. As echoed before, wood, packing material, firewood can be the primary mechanism by which many of these invasive species are moved, so please don't move firewood. We do have pretty much concluded that the gold-spotted oak borer was transferred on firewood. You see signs like this out there. People became very aware of it when large trees are dying. That's a cute little face of that borer. Right? Only an entomologist could look. So that looks so menacing. I had somebody ask me after a talk, it was just depressing. I was talking about all of these invasive species coming in, and they're like, what are we going to have left? And I've actually tried to think of a good answer for that, and I love the idea that with bacteria being so good at adjusting, we might just be in a big bacterial goop soup. Goop soup might be our future. But not all of the pests are this scary looking. This is the list of insects that damage oaks. Some of them are invasive. Some of them are native species. This is a list I compiled just looking through the records of things that we regularly have to manage on oaks across the US. It's not a little list. The only thing that I could find across that probably had more number of pests associated that we manage is our maple. I think part of it is because oaks are this foundational tree. They have evolved together with insects for 65 million plus years. They live in harmony with most of these most of the time. So ambrosia beetles, those are nasties. A lot of them, those are invasive. But things like, canker worms, flat-headed apple tree borer, those things, native things, but non-native things like gypsy moth can come in. They're not going to kill it quickly, but it's that death by continually chipping away at the resources of a plant. So let's take gypsy moth, for example. This is an invasive species, but it's one that I realized how important it was. It's not something I've dealt with in the southeast, but as I've traveled up through the northeast, something is really important when it can be seen from space. That is the stamp of importance, right? Great Wall of China, gypsy moth defoliation, So if you look at this right here, you can see this is the summertime. This brown area right there is where the gypsy moth has defoliated. Here's a side-by-side of prior to, the prior month and then after the gypsy moth had been feeding. Tens of millions of acres defoliated. I don't know why the astronauts were looking for that. Get bored up there in the space station. And this is what just a little caterpillar that munches leaves has left behind. We know a big oak tree can handle a big defoliation event. But what if it happens year after year? We know gypsy moth continues to feed for a number of years. It will build up in populations. Last year rivaled the gypsy moth population in 1981. So we're seeing this, but it wasn't just the gypsy moth that caused that. What else are we seeing? Climate disruption, drought, other beetles coming in, diseases. So I often wonder too, what is the causal factor? I'd rather blame diseases and say the insects are coming in. But we can thumb wrestle about that later. So let's just look at some of the history. So as I was invited to the Arboretum, I started reading a little bit more about this oak decline and realized it was going on a wide scale. It's been happening for a very long time. And one of the cop-out things that you can learn if you're a young scientist not quite fully into your career yet, decline is a very useful word when you don't know what caused the problem. So sometimes it's the cop-out word, right? And I have read those papers. I've read the last chapter of the the dissertations that say, well, we don't really know what causes the problem. But I was going to figure it out, right? I was going to come in and save the day and figure out what was killing these trees at the Arboretum. So I started getting into the literature. And this is a study that was finished up, I think they published it in 2015, looking at the history of defoliators in Virginia just specifically, but I think it would echo throughout this region. And you can see there's the three that they're primarily looking at is the fall cankerworm, which is a non-native, gypsy moth, which is a non-native, and then the native defoliators. So you can see over time, you get these major increases and decreases in defoliators. And right here, we see some massive increases in the gypsy moth. That's normal. It's been going on forever. Gypsy moth is the only invasive species that does not stay in a stasis with its host. What do I mean by that? So generally in that arms race, that 65 million year arms race, they come to a gentleman's agreement that they're not going to kill each other, right? So that a pest will be allowed to feed on this host. They don't want to kill it, so they'll have food. The tree can tolerate some damage, promises not to do anything too nasty to the pest feeding on it, and they go along, everybody's happy. Gypsy moth is the only invasive species that in its native range will wipe out huge areas of trees because of this cyclical nature. But mostly I just want to illustrate that we are seeing greater and greater peaks of defoliation over the years. What caused it? Is it happening naturally just because? Is it climate effects? Is it because of diseases that the trees already have that they're queuing in on? I don't know. So how do we study these climate effects? It's very hard to grow a 200-foot oak tree in a greenhouse. So how do we study climate change impacts over a long span? Well, let's just take oak licanium scale. It's a common scale pest on oak trees. So let's test the hypothesis about what climate change might be doing. And that's exactly what Stephen Frank at NC State University has done with his students in their lab. They realized by just being observant that oak trees along urban corridors, along roadways, had much worse oak licanium scale. This is a scale species. It's a soft scale. It just sucks out the juices. Underneath each one of those shells those are all eggs that will hatch. So you can imagine that a population can get out of hand very badly. But as they observed this, somebody had the idea, well, let's lay a heat map over the city and see if it corresponds with what's happening with this oak licanium scale. And sure enough, with a very high degree of accuracy, you can predict which trees are going to have issues with licanium scale. It's warmer along those corridors. We know insects are temperature dependent, they're cold-blooded. So yeah, that could make sense. But it doesn't affect all scale species the same. They have differential responses to this temperature effect. And I was reminded as I was out there in the herbarium, the way that they were able to show that looking at these trees would echo climate change because species respond differently is they had a very stalwart grad student go and look through herbarium specimens from the 1900s on and look at scales that were on the branches from collected trees, map the location of where those trees were collected from early 1800s on, counting scale species in herbarium specimens. This is why entomologists don't get paid a lot. I don't know how wise that was, but it revealed that those urban corridors do echo very nicely what we might expect in a warming climate in particular. So we do know that the oak licanium scale is going to increase. Gloomy scale on maple is going to increase. So we can predict a few of those things. Here's just a picture of these oak licanium scale crawlers as they come out into the spring. So, I have not told you about a lot of the specific pests, about the nididulid beetles. I think what I want to get across is that there are so many factors that impact the health of trees. How many in here like trees? Awesome. You have a big, big hand up as far as it goes, because the important thing is to know what a healthy tree looks like. Because what we train is to find and look at trees and see when they start looking unhealthy. If you're a mom, I don't know how many moms we have in here, you look at your kid, you can just look and tell they don't feel good. So to be able to look at a tree and see, okay, it's not looking well. So regardless of whether it's an invasive species or a native species, or its climate, something you can't control, if you can see something's going on with that plant and try to get it back to its native healthy form, get it back to the form that we all love. And I know people say they love trees, but there's a lot of bad things people do to trees. Maybe not intentionally. We see heat stress, cold damage, lightning strikes. That's a big thing on oaks too. We know oak trees that are struck by lightning are 90% more likely to get borer attacks. So just using lightning protection can be a major saver. People plant trees too deeply. I can barely look at it. But then we see things like 2,4-D damage. That's a herbicide. Air pollution. Clorox overspray. This poor thing. Look at that. I always wonder when they tie them up where they think those trees are going to go. They tie them down. This particular one, and I'm going to wrap up and let Neil talk about how we mitigate the factors, because regardless of the species of insect getting on it, we know a healthy tree is either going to be able to defend itself better or it's going to be less susceptible. I'm standing here at a ballpark talking to the manager, and he's like, I don't know what's happening with these trees. Oops, let me go back. He said, they're planted well, everything seems to be fine, the soil's fine. And as we're talking, he's standing here, I'm talking to him, and behind him is a young child with a baseball bat whacking on this tree. I said, I think you have there were some four-letter words, but you have a four-legged creature and not a six-legged creature affecting your tree. And then, sometimes we see some really bad pruning jobs. They're a little more obvious. So the oaks are suffering threats by 1,000 cuts. So I'm suggesting that we heal them by 1,000 small acts of kindness, by planting trees correctly, appreciating what a healthy tree looks like, and trying to get it back to that state. And so Neil gets to continue on with that good stuff because he's seen it all in the field. And he can sure tell you a lot about it. So thank you so much.
All right, well, the thing about Gretchen is I get so tired of that, how y'all doing today? And it's like, if you're from Jersey, it's like, how you doing? So let me start there. And so what's key here is you have to recognize that the earlier speakers were from public agencies or other things, and Gretchen alluded to her salary. We're a private company. We're in the business of making money. We have to answer her extortionate salary demands. So, but I do want to say, because of these things, as other people speak, other things come in. So one of the key things is because we're primarily, and also before I forget, which I guarantee you I will, I have to say things first. So among the things that George alluded to, in the case of Phytophthora, the Phytoptheras we see are our most common root disease, mostly from cultural problems, which I will address a little bit. But we can treat them. The problems are cultural and they are other things. You used a magic word, George, that most people probably missed, but I picked up on like that. expensive. Welcome to Bartlett. So the other thing is oak wilt. Because we're also a nationwide company, we've had good success treating it by trenching to break root grafts and injecting with a fungicide called propiconazole. So if you want to maintain specimen trees, you can. Bacterial leaf scorch is another thing that, because we need to try to treat this, my colleague and former boss, he's boss emeritus, Bruce Frederick, have been working for years since the first outbreak in that part of Jersey, the epicenter down near Burlington along the Delaware River, with trying to treat it. And what surprises us, because of some of the academic data, is you would think that different strains would come up. But so far, oxytetracycline, an antibiotic that is probably on the shelves of many pharmacies, has been effective in suppressing. We have no cure. So what we see is that primarily pin oaks and red oaks, the thing about emerald ash borer, the reason you're all aware of it, it's frighteningly dramatic. Bacterial leaf scorch is slow, it's undramatic. Some trees adjacent, you don't see it. But then again, as I've worked on this, what we do see is it doesn't typically stay asymptomatic forever. Those trees, especially and I'll get to this if I have any time, in alleys or groups of trees. We'd rather there warrant 400 identical swamp white oaks at the World Trade Center that we take care of. But anywhere you have large numbers of trees like that, we've seen other trees near pin oaks and red oaks that we treat come up with it. Swamp white oaks, black oaks. But those are the primary species. And now the red oak is a state tree of New Jersey. And because it comes up so slowly and it's expensive to treat and we can't cure it but only suppress it, it's really as dramatic to those of us who deal with it as emerald ash borer. Now, so the research is ongoing to try to find a way to penetrate the goop, the biofilm, and annually our treatments include that. But surprisingly enough, oxytetracycline, OTC, for some of us who have been treating this problem for over a decade, it's effective. The trees get better. We don't understand it any better than a lot of people do. But the issue is we don't see the trees going into inevitable failure. So that's where I wanted to start on. You can ask questions later. So what I'm going to break it up into two little parts here, which everybody has alluded to in one way or another, and hopefully this is a summary. But then again, there's always somebody before lunch whose talk has to be cut. So they got a guy from Jersey who can talk a lot faster than he has to. So listen to the difference between Gretchen and me. I could talk even faster than this. I could do one of those commercials. Anyway, it's harder than you think to solve these problems because we need to do it. Climate, I'll use the word global warming, I should use climate disruption, but I understand from reliable sources on Twitter that there isn't any. So don't worry, it's made up. But here's what everybody has been alluding to on a larger scale, is when you have the temperature dependence of insects, the temperature dependent of photosynthesis, all these other discussions of where oak's going, where it's fading out, where it's increasing, is fundamentally a simple physiology question. And it's really good at simple because I am one of the world's poorest physiologists. In fact, I should ask Todd to come up and fill in the gaps. But the warmer it gets, the faster photosynthesis runs, all other things being equal. And so what happens is, as you see this move up, photosynthesis moves up to a peak and respiration keeps on going. Net photosynthesis, net primary production is likely to decrease. And what happens, Gretchen partially alluded to it, when trees are healthy, there is a likelihood they are better able to defend themselves, although it does vary by insect. Now, some like healthier trees. Fertilize a hemlock and see what happens. So, and then what happens, and we haven't really talked about this much, but this is the future. It's going to be about water. If you want to run those processes, you were going to need the water to do it. The evapotranspiration in trees accelerates the resources are going to be more precious, and of course the climate disruption that doesn't exist is likely to create more extremes, more droughts. And so if you look also at not just, you've probably all seen, and especially if you're gardeners, you've seen the plant hardiness zones map change. The last time I believe it changed was in 2006, unless it's been updated. But if you look at the plant heat zone map and look at the number of days over 86, and more importantly, the nights that don't go below 70. If you're in the metropolitan area, you know about this. We're getting fewer nights below 70. That graph I just showed means respiration in the dark is still running pretty fast. So this is something to consider, that net primary production means that plants are going to be under stress. What seems to be happening, regardless of whether it's CO2 mitigated or not, is that spring is starting earlier and fall is lasting longer. We know this. And there was, among the cool studies, other people have alluded to some pretty cool studies. There was one, I think, done by a Harvard graduate student that went out to Walden Pond and looked at Thoreau's records and what's there now. Not only has the species turned over, but I think her data show that, I found it pretty compelling, that spring is coming 18 days earlier already. So we know winters are getting milder. There's less snow. That's just Yankee dandruff, as Gretchen said. So, and among the other gee whiz things you can put out there is, I think I have a colleague in my township committee whose niece, Michaela Schifrin, is like the world slalom champion. And among the things that they find to run those things is that in the 60s, there were like 30 places you could hold the Winter Olympics. Now it's down to 8, and the last several, as you know, have been made mostly on artificial snow and warm temperatures. So summers, you know, are getting hotter. The events are getting more extreme. So the storms, I mean, everybody is talking about today's weather, obviously. But even something like when we deal with tree risk as arborists, well, the bigger events, suppose trees could withstand 50-mile-an-hour winds without a concern. In the future of tree risk assessment, we're going to be looking to whether trees can withstand 60, 70, 80, because Sandy was an 80 to 90-mile-an-hour storm where I live. So you have these sorts of issues. All these things are changing, these interactions. Anybody who does any diagnostics knows very well that if it's a single factor, you can nail it. We're all good at that. Add a second factor, add an insect and an environmental issue, an insect and a disease, it becomes complicated. Add 3, and it's very hard to do a casual observational analysis of variance to figure those things out. So I'm going to try to address that sort of effect. And it's all happening at a faster rate than we ever thought. Climate disruption is not necessarily gradual, nor is it linear. But the other thing that you're looking at here and other places, this came up earlier, is for most of us, especially, I brought this in just because we're in the metropolitan New York area, we have the heat island effect. So what Gretchen alluded to about the trees and the insects along roadways, you can magnify for any place that you're within, basically, well, as far away as I am, 40 miles west in Jersey, is likely to be somewhat impacted by the additional fact of the heat island effect. There's a paper from a couple of years ago. We knew this intuitively, and so many times the things we know intuitively, you see somebody did a great PhD thesis, probably all you folks, and you get finally real data to confirm what you always thought or were taught. So it's not that drought isn't implicated in the death of trees. It's that the effect of a severe drought once can last a lot longer. The effect of a single defoliation of gypsy moth, the trees might recover. But when you look at these factors adding together, and one serious impact, it's the difference between a chronic problem, oak decline, and an acute problem. An acute problem here, one pest and another pest. Gretchen showed that slide of several pests over a long time. This is where we are. We get a severe drought. We get an outbreak of something else. Soil moisture becomes a big issue. This is from the Climate Change Atlas, and Bill, the first Bill, alluded to this. Second Bill did too. about what's going to happen to oaks. So if you look at where we are and look at our cover type, as foresters would call it, and look at what species they are, look at the quantity of maple, beech, and birch. For the foresters, we always use those terms: beech, birch, maple, forest, oak, hickory forests. And if you look at, well, something happened. It's supposed to be back there. Yeah. Anyway, it did stop there when I last did it. Anyway, what you see here is that, look at that change. Yeah, oaks could be the big winner here because of their, well, the way I learned it in school was ecological amplitude. They have a broad range of tolerance. But you can also see that if we're going to look for trees, and I hope this comes out in the right place, if we're going to look for trees in the future, it did. Maybe we should, when people say plant natives, it drives a lot of people like me crazy. And the reason is native to where? There's a professor at Rutgers who's the king of the one-liners named Jason Grabowski. And he said, the environment is changing forward. Planting natives is thinking backward. There's plenty of well-adapted genera out there. So the other thing that we get these magazines, and what this says is looking at this idea of resilience. Where are we going to get these trees? Where are we going to look at our future oak forest? We're going to look for places that have a wide variety of ecological characteristics. You heard both bills talk about this morning. You have to try to preserve as many as possible, and these would amount to refugia. So if you're going to get trees that will recover from disturbance and have all the ecological functions, we're going to have to find these areas very carefully, cultivate them, preserve them, and propagate from there. This is, if you've never seen the Garden Professor's blog, I recommend it. They're great people. Bert Craig's one of them. And what they're just saying is, I stole this from him, find those genotypes that are broadly adaptable. That's what we're talking about. He just said it better than I could. Everybody says something better than I could in fewer words. But then again, you know, a picture's worth 1,000 words. I always give 1,000 words. Anyway, this is what it boils down to. Talking to Todd during the break, this is what this place is for. Find out what works. We're going to be experimental because of the interactions we cannot predict. So on a long-term scale, what are we going to do about oaks? You need to have them survive. So you know, if you're going to get trees that will fail. I have some Pyrenean oaks in my yard that I got from a grad student at Yale. And they're performing marvelously well. In fact, I have a few, and I'm going to give them to an arboretum. Because they seem to be well adapted. But you just have to take chances. You're going to be planting things. You're going to be adventurous. You're going to have to be. There's not going to be much choice. I already said this, native to where? Someone I heard not too many years ago said we should be planting native to Richmond now and native to Atlanta in 10 years. But that west side of the Appalachians, the idea is search the world. You know, there are other places. So there's no point in saying natives are superior. You have to be flexible. You have to be adaptable. Don't get hung up on natives. I'm all with that. There's well-adapted genera around the globe. That's why arboreta and botanical gardens are so wonderful. They have the opportunity to do that. So, to rush through that part, let me talk about the things that Gretchen finished with. She wanted me to be positive. Forget it. That's not what I do. I don't do nice. I don't do positive. So what are you going to do? It's just these things that you probably already know about. I mentioned this to somebody else, said, you know, I'd like to retire soon without ever having to talk about this. And somebody at work said, you know, you're going to be dead 50 years. We're still going to be talking about this. So, Ed Gilman, who is he just retired, a sensible guy. And what he says, he's done a lot of work on plants. So I didn't want to talk about breaking up roots and doing all the things that we do all the time. He has another great single line. Roots have to be at the surface and they have to be straight. No, if you have a container plant and stick it in the ground, not acceptable. If you have a bare root and you wrap the roots, no. That it can't be done, and the root flare has to be at the surface. I hope I'm preaching to the choir, because it would break my heart if I weren't. Because, one of the things we never think about in the future, everything we're talking about here, except for the initial speakers, you realize that what I'm talking about are artificial ecosystems, residential ecosystems. We created them. What Bill and Bill were talking about was natural ecosystems. Gretchen and I deal with residential ecosystems, things that people have created. Huge amount of concrete infrastructure, things in the way, compacted soils. So if you're going to grow a tree, what we realize is sustainability is not serial plantings of trees that last 7 years, which is what the urban forest basically is. What we would like to see is, how would you like to get a tree to grow to maturity to do what oaks can do with storage of carbon? And of course, there was this study out of Columbia some years ago that said that as foresters always thought that trees would get to a certain size, they become over mature, their carbon sequestration decreases, they have to come down. But the data out of Columbia was that those oak trees are still sequestering carbon at a fast rate. Not only that, but a faster rate, kind of a compound interest formula with growth rings. So what you're looking at here, for example, is 1,000 cubic feet to get a tree to grow to, what's that, 10 inches? 37 cubic yards. If you look at a tree truck, if you know what that looks like, that holds about 10 to 12 fully packed. So we're talking about a lot of wood. Oh yeah, a dumpster will do it, a 40-yard dumpster. I knew I had an idea. That's what it will take to grow a tree to a large size, to its design intent, to its mature size, to grow it to 24 inches in diameter, for example. So if you think about that, these mass plantings and all that, no wonder things fail. So the other thing that only has been slightly alluded to that we deal with every day in trying to keep oak trees and every other alive, it's soil. And I think it was Da Vinci said in the 1500s, we know more about the celestial bodies than we know about soils beneath our feet. It's still pretty much true. And what we haven't said before is it's one ecosystem. If you want to keep your oak tree alive, you have to manage that soil ecosystem, because you already heard that the soil ecosystem with an oak tree is virtually unique. So if you want sustainable plants, you want oak trees. So for example, don't just fertilize your trees. This is a particular pet peeve in an era when water becomes more precious too. Our fertilizer standard says only fertilize to correct deficiencies and have a goal. Don't put on tons if you want to maintain an old tree. The data out there now, gradually accumulating, it's in its infancy. Young trees are like teenagers. You give them a pizza, they don't eat a couple of slices, they eat it and ask for another. An old tree like me, if I eat a whole pizza, I'm training for a Masters Sumo tournament. So, you don't. Old trees recycle most of that. So you don't need to fertilize them routinely. And where does unneeded fertilizer go, especially nitrogen and phosphorus? It either volatilizes or it ends up in a water body, and New York's very sensitive about that, especially for those of you who know about it, the Croton watershed. So you can get a soil sample. So if you're here to listen to scientists, be a scientist, test your soil. Find out what oak tree will do well in that soil. Find out what will not. Don't push the limits. If you don't match the tree in its soil, you'll have much less luck. I will race through this. This is just soil samples taken from the nearest office, Elmsford. And I think everybody from our office is here. Just to show you what our soil samples have said over the years, so when you approach this, you'll know, perhaps, don't just routinely fertilize. So this is the closest we get to nitrogen. We look at estimated nitrogen release. I won't go into it. But what you see up there is 3,000 samples. You get 3,000 samples over an area, you're starting to get data. But do you think you need an ordinary nitrogen fertilizer to dump on your plants unless you want to push a lot of growth? No. How about phosphorus? How about that NPK? You think you need the phosphorus in your fertilizer? The pool of phosphorus in the soils around here, as they are almost everywhere, is enormous. The trick is getting it out. I'll get to that in a second. Okay, potassium's a critically important nutrient. Maybe you can use it because half your soils probably need it. Oh yeah, but most NPK fertilizers don't have manganese, and manganese is a critical part of the photosynthetic mechanism. And if you have a deficiency of it, oh well, you can apply all the other things. If you've ever heard of Justus von Liebig, who developed the law of the minimum, if you have a critical deficiency of one, you won't get anything out of the others. So one of those things, why to take a soil sample. Also, it surprised me, I will say, that you have in many of your soils almost half high pH. And if you don't get the pH right, a lot of your nutrition will not work out, as in the case of, this. If you haven't seen this, you should, and it simply says that trees, most oak trees like at 5.5 to 6.5, you get much higher and you watch the iron disappear, you'll see chlorosis in oak trees. If you get it much lower, then a lot of nutrients start to disappear. So when you fertilize trees and you don't take a soil test, you have no idea what's going on. The future of our fertilization in many cases is correcting pH. And I'll mention one other thing, which is right there. Organic matter. Look at that. We test for organic matter in our soil samples. So a lot of your soils don't have enough organic matter. And so one of these talks, when we do these things, one talk's called, cleverly enough, Organic Matters. So what you might want to consider is mulch in your home landscape. All these other things, compost tea, don't look for magic bullets. They're not out there. Mulch in water is a great thing. That mulch. It's a beautiful thing. And if you are, and you've heard this already about how oaks like to grow, if you're doing residential trees, that tree and its soil is an ecosystem. A very, very competent researcher named Brian Scherenbrock, who used to be at the Morton Arboretum, did a enormous factorial, and what he found, he did compost tea, fertilizer, mixed, matched, did all these things, and I went blind, that's why I wear glasses now. And at the bottom in that corner where all the things came down, the significance was if you want to grow trees, oak trees, the best thing you can do for your soil is put down a mixture of compost and mulch. One is a little farther along and one is getting there. So 50-50, there you go. And the rest, take a soil test and now you're getting somewhere. Don't do this, you know this, don't do this. If they do it here, it's because they have to do it, because it's the aesthetic demand. But your house, you don't have to do that. Don't put turf up to the edge of trees. The data on that are pretty unequivocal, by the way. It's been shown over and over that you want to suppress tree growth, put turf on top of the tree roots. This is probably the most overused slide in arboriculture, but Gary Watson, another fine researcher at the Morton Arboretum, had his sugar maples underperforming under grass. So what he did was he said, okay, I'll take some and I'll mulch them. That's 3 inches of mulch. That's more than we usually like. 2 is a good number for us. And that, of course, it's a birch tree. I know it's not an oak, but it shows turf to the base. So what he did was, that was just after 3 years, he got 5 times the root growth. So are mulching's a good thing? Yeah, and it should look like this. Nice root flare. What a beautiful thing. So I'm not going to belabor root flares. It drives me nuts. The single best diagnostic, when I talk about diagnostics of a young tree, or even a tree that's up to about that big, if I can make that tree move in the ground, that's the first thing. I mean, I don't need to go to the gym. Just try to make trees rock. If you can rock a small tree, there's no roots on it. It was planted poorly. It was grown poorly. We're not throwing anybody under the chip truck as to how it got that way, but that's how they get that way. So coming all the way back around, this is the thing. When you're talking about the future of oak trees on your landscape or anywhere, it's going to be about water. This is, I stole this from Bruce Frederick at our lab. The future is either going, and I tell my daughter, who's a landscape architect, the future is going to be either you're going to get very drought tolerant plants or you're going to need irrigation. In the world of drought and extreme storms, irrigation is, we're not in that business, but we should be. We try to work with those people as closely as we can, but when there's drought restrictions and you can't water, then what? Well, then what? This is, if you go to any landscape architecture, ASLA kind of meetings, everybody talks about this. This sort of thing, storing. Or more on my scale, this is, that's actually where Gretchen has somebody keeping beer for her. But this is the back of my house. No, I'm kidding. But you get the idea. And what I wanted to mention is, this is not an eye chart, but what I wanted to show you is a couple of ideas. One of the most common questions we as arborists get is, how much do I water? And, you know, a year-old tree, okay, 7 gallons a week in April. Hey, there it goes again. This is why they wanted my slides 3 days early, so they could make it do this. But in August, you're talking about 28, I'm sorry. You knew I was like that. So, you know, a young tree, 56 gallons. Think about this. How much, you know, how many, if you deal with customers the way we do, everybody says, but I watered. No, you didn't. You had sprinklers on or something. That's not the way to do it. And that would say 224 in August for a young tree, 4 to 7 years old. It's a lot of water. And if you want to measure it, okay, there's all kinds of easy rain gauges, but do it. Somehow or other, look at how much your plants need. It's a little bit of backyard science. Don't guess. Figure it out. Figure it out. Okay, one rule of thumb, and I've got several. An inch of water a week. Or if you take a 10 gallon per minute per hose, then it's 550 gallons for a 40-inch tree. Lots of water. We know about this. We've heard about this. The transpiration of a big tree can be 500 gallons plus. These are oak trees that do so well are transpiring all this water. What Bill didn't talk about the Harvard Forest, which I'm sure is significant data to collect, is what's the evapotranspiration out of that system. In and out of that system, what happens to it. So these rules of thumb, just whatever you think you're doing, it's probably not enough, and any more, and your well will go dry or your water bill will be insane. But just to put it in the context of what's coming about sustaining these oak forests, tree diameter times 5 minutes, that sort of thing. Best way, we like soaker hoses. Overhead irrigation is not good. All the leaf diseases that George alluded to, that's one way to make sure they're there to confuse you about the other diseases, is keep overhead irrigation on. We like emitters, things like that. I always recommend that it looks like that and we cover it with mulch. Put the soaker hose under the mulch. I have 2 trees, 2 Japanese maples, 60 years old, that I took from someone else in our company who said, I'm just going to cut them down. He's an arborist, really. So I put them in my house. They're gorgeous. But I put the soaker hose under the mulch, and I couldn't get the soaker hose out in the fall. The roots had wrapped around the soaker hose. So is water a big deal in this, and is mulch a good thing? Yeah, but the two together. These are fine. Just don't Google gator bags because you get Gucci. And they start very expensive. George alluded to expensive. This is expensive. They're called tree gators. So this is what our answer. This is yes, it sounds like an infomercial, but just to show you how we have approached the problem to try to solve this to keep the individual oaks on a landscape alive. We call it root invigoration. It just goes like this. We use that device, an air spade, to excavate excess soil to get rid of it. Then we try to cut those circling roots that everybody put in when the tree was planted. We try to get those roots back on the surface and straight, the way they're supposed to be, to create a sustainable tree. All those urbanized compacted soils, we decompact it. We correct those deficiencies, and it just so happened that this all came when this one device that was invented during World War II, but was first used in the early 60s by Brooklyn Union Gas to excavate gas lines so they wouldn't blow up the neighborhood, this air spade. And then we add organic matter and this material I don't have time to talk about called biochar, which you might have heard of. We get the mulch right, and then that's what we call it. Let's see, I don't know if this will work. We hope it does. It should. We'll try. If you haven't seen this, this is what it does. We're making potting soil for trees. We're making forest soils the kind that Bill Schuster alluded to in natural stands. So if you want to sustain an oak tree, what we need to do is create those ideal conditions. This is just our way of doing it. This particular device is useful because it doesn't damage fine roots. If you do it mechanically with a tiller, you'll tear up the roots. That's why it's such a big deal. And then, of course, what do? We water it in, and we continue to water it. We can kill a tree by creating ideal conditions and then starving it for water. So we have to follow up. That's compost tea. And yes, that's a woman despite the look of the picture. This is how I usually finish, which I will today. So there I am. There you are.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Gretchen. Thank you, George. All right, we have a few minutes for questions. So if the speakers would come up to the stage, just kind of sit in front, and there should be a mic moving its way through the audience. So if you have a question for any of the speakers, raise your hand. Okay, yeah. Eli looks like. Yeah, Eli, that's fine. Yes, you can sit in the front of the stage. Just sit on the front of the stage. It's great. Go ahead.
Okay. Are you ready?
Yep.
Bill Logan, what do you think the Chinese people did with oak trees?
That's a very interesting question. They have quite a lot of them. I don't know very much about it. I ran out of time to research and also money to go to places like that. But there are 100 species there, and there's a lot going on. I can tell you that in a lot of the Orient, there was also an awful lot of compensated pollarding in the old days to be able to repeatedly harvest oak trees. I don't know the details in China, but in Japan it's still practiced. And there's a lot of efforts now to preserve it because it still happens. Oak trees were very economically important in the Orient as they were here. And that's about all I know about it.
Okay, there's another question up at the back. Yeah.
Thank you, all of you. I think this is a combined question for Dr. Bill and Dr. Neil, putting together what you said. In Black Rock, your experiment showed counterintuitively that if you removed trees, you wound up with more soil moisture. And Neil said that with warming, water will be a limiting resource. And then we look at the Jim Urban stuff. Regardless of warming, soil volume is a limiting resource. So should we be thinking about lower stocking levels? Fewer, more healthy trees rather than more stressed trees?
I guess it depends on what type of environment you're talking about, but in a drying landscape, less water to go around, absolutely. I think that was part of what Neil was talking about too, in terms of her, sorry, who was it? Was it George? About planting densities, too high density is absolutely crazy. You're not going to have the water to sustain it, particularly in a drier climate.
And the only other thing about that is understand that the studies that Bill presented are relatively short-term compared to the scale that I was trying to get across, that we're talking about looking out a century, climate scales, and they're dealing more with weather scales.
Thank you.
I had a question for George. You had mentioned that oak wilt had been around since 1881, about 136 years. I was just wondering, it's fairly new to this area, and there's been a lot of buzz about the disease. How severe do you think that it's going to be, considering it's, we've had information on it for over a century, and how effective is changing the pruning time in managing it on a large scale, or does there need to be fungicidal treatments to manage it effectively?
Okay, well, let's see where to start with that. In terms of oak wilt showing up in New York State, keep in mind that the other than firewood transport for long distance transfer, there aren't insects that carry it a long way. So I kind of look at ask myself whether or not the increased incidence or what we're seeing here now is partly a consequence just of the firewood trade and the way it may have changed over the years. The other thing that lurks in the back of my mind is that for as many years, and I think this could be as many as 40 years, that people, the colleagues I've had at least, have picked up oak wilt in various parts of the Northeast and individual state. I think I mentioned, whoever is in charge goes in and cuts that tree down, and it hasn't spread like it did in the upper Midwest. But that doesn't, so that makes me wonder what would happen if we just took down individual trees here, but it doesn't make me so confident that I wouldn't go in and do everything you can around these individual instances as they occur. I just think that to sit back complacently and let this thing go on its own would be a tragic mistake. Insofar as the pruning time goes, I tell you that I'm really conservative about this, and Neil, I'd be curious to see what you think about this too, but I think that to the extent you can, when you're not having to worry about like storm repair or something else, if it's just cosmetic pruning and you can put it off to the dormant season, I think you're better off. And then, as I mentioned as well, I think this wound dressing thing, I would put it on anytime I prune an oak tree at this point, and especially if there's any record of oak wilt in the area. I just wouldn't screw around with it.
And I was just going to address with the oak wilt and to tie in that, there are a lot of diseases, root rot, phytophthora, armillaria, things like that, that we see constantly with oaks that are always there in the soil, and until some stressor causes that plant to either be weakened or that organism to be strengthened, we don't really see it impact the tree. I'm wondering too if there might be this oak wilt in many, many areas. The vector is not super, it doesn't fly very far. They're lazy. These beetles don't fly far. I'm wondering too if a lot of the stressors that we see, particularly in urban areas, are contributing, because there is no tree native to a Walmart parking lot. So it is unusual stressors, and I think we might be seeing just expression.
I'm from I have a home on Long Island, and I'm kind of curious how I can stay in touch to find out what the diagnosis is going to be on the oak wilt that's been identified as possibly being there now, and then what are the steps that you can practically take, like not buying firewood?
Well, you can. I'm not quite sure to what extent firewood that is sold in this state is certified. But there is certainly there is a conscientious effort at the state level, either through ag and markets or the DEC, to try to curtail the introduction of firewood from out of state, especially from I'll call them dangerous areas. So I wouldn't say don't buy firewood. I'm not willing to go that far. But did you say you have oak wilt diagnosed in your area?
No, but on the map you identified
Oh,
about
yeah.
5 or 6 places on
Yeah,
Long
yeah.
Island. So
Right.
if you're on Long Island in another
Right.
neighborhood,
Yeah, I think,
how
okay,
can
so
stay
if
in
you,
touch with what's going on and whether you should start to really work?
yeah, I really think that for starters, I think the best thing to do is familiarize yourself with the symptoms of the disease. And if you even have a remote fear or concern by what you're seeing in your property or in your neighborhood, that there might be something unusual going on, either get a hold of your cooperative extension agent or association. They are well positioned to take samples and ship them up to us at Cornell. Bartlett has a research diagnostics facility. I'm sure you take them as well there. Although there is this little angle about shipping potentially diseased plant material across state lines. So So I don't know what you guys do about that, but anyways, it's one way or another. But I would get them tested right away. But at least get a hold of your Extension Association office. And on Long Island's got some of the best horticultural extension people in the state. So you'll be in good hands. You have a good place to start, and prompt diagnosis is by far and away the best stretch. And then if a diagnosis does occur, you pretty much got to take that tree down right away and then scope out. On Island, you can do trenching to isolate that particular tree from some of the nearby trees. And sometimes this trenching seems to be a little bit, it seems to be a rather radical undertaking. But if the consequence is to put a large population of trees at risk, I think it's worthwhile. And you can do it on Long Island because the soils are much easier trenched than they might be like in this cemetery in Brooklyn or something. Does that help?
Hi, Dr. Hubbard. I have a question for you. So I work at a nursery, flowering trees and shrubs department, and perennial plants. I also study here in the continuing education class for sustainable gardening practices. I'm in the front lines regarding unloading those trucks from the West Coast and also choosing which plants to bring over here. You had a resource that seemed invaluable for people like myself as far as which plants carried. What was that resource? And then the second thing is, we also sell firewood. Is kiln-dried wood more efficient at killing any type of issues? Okay,
so I'm not 100% sure, but I'm 99.999% sure that kiln-dried firewood is not going to harbor any pathogen of any kind, and I don't think any insects either. But it's, geez, that would be expensive as heck. But it would be okay. Okay, the second one is with regard to a resource. I wish I could just give you a website off the top of my head, but I don't really have it.
There's a sudden oak
death
website.
Yeah, there is a oak mortality task force, I think is what it's called. And if you Google that, then that's actually very up to date. It's California. It comes out of California, but still, that's where the action is right now, and that would be the best place to keep track of things. And they update that quite regularly.
The majority of the woody plants that you showed are actually very easily found in this region. So
That's correct. That's correct.
Family, whatnot, so that's why I was asking.
Yeah, but even though the plants are in this region, I mean, most of them or many of them come to us as nursery stock from the West Coast. So yeah, so again, that's probably the best resource I can recommend.
All right, so I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you all for sharing your procedures. I learned a lot. But my question is regarding genetically modified organisms. Can you guys just touch on that a little bit?
The question was about GMOs. Anything specific about GMOs? I'm sorry, anything specific about GMOs?
No, I mean, there's a whole world of it. I'm just wondering anybody's perspective.
The only thing I'm willing to put my toe in the deep end about that is the subject of, maybe you all know about it better than I, of mRNAi. That the idea that DNA, the messenger RNA is a single strand, DNA is a double strand. So you can modify a second strand apparently, and it will, and as the tree recognizes it, it treats it as a pathogen and prevents it. So the idea that someday we'll nick a tree and inject it with something like that, modified DNA to resist a particular pest, I think is as far out in the future that involves genetics that I certainly understand, other than things like I just heard that there's a tree called bulletproof hemlock now in the nursery trade, which is resistant because there were resisting hemlocks. And just like chestnuts and elms, you search long enough, and I think George alluded to this, and sort of one of the bills, that when you find resistance, you just have to get it, work with it, and it takes decades.
So that's the extent that I think most people working with trees know about GMOs.
Okay, well, thank you, speakers. A round of applause.